So I'm really excited to introduce the Painting Pairs Art History and Technical Study, which is, as you know, a collaborative research opportunity for students doing masters and doctoral students at the Courtauld. So they have to be registered at the Courtauld in other areas of study than conservation, and they are given the opportunity to form research partnerships with future conservators in the second year of the Masters in Conservation of Easel Paintings. Each pairing explores technical and historical research focused on the painting undergoing analysis or treatment in the Department of Conservation. And the paintings come from both public collections, private collections, and sometimes from the Courtauld Gallery. So, exciting moment. Today the 5 pairs of graduate students will present the results of their collaborative research one by one, and we've all been waiting for this day towards the end of this long and hard term. And the programme doesn't count towards any kind of degree, so it's something that people do in addition to the degrees that they're following. So I'm very appreciative of that, and I hope that that experience that they've had has been worthwhile for them. I've got to thank the Research Forum for supporting this for 13 years now, especially Leila and Diego have been very great at organising it. And to also say that after the talks, there'll be drinks in the Research Forum, which is just here, up one floor, up one floor, and you can all come if you want to. And also, the talks will be recorded so that people who aren't here, who want to see it, can see it for a month afterwards on YouTube. So the order will go with the oldest work of art to the most modern, and I hope that you'll ask questions of each pair as they present their work or after they presented their works, and they'll take the questions. And at the end of the questions, they'll introduce the next set of pairs. So, welcome, first pair, Sam Byfield and Anna Sophia Petrovic, who are looking at the allegory of May and June from a private collection.
Hello, my name is Sam Byfield, and I am the MA Conservation of Easel Painting student.
And my name is Anna Sophia Petrovic, and I am an MA History of Art student. In our last presentation in January, we introduced this small panel painting entitled The Allegory of May and June, and its relationship to a history of calendar making and the labours of the months. The female figure to the left of the panel represents the month of May, and the male figure to the right represents the month of June, as indicated by the Latin inscriptions Maius and Junius, along with the zodiac symbols for Gemini and Cancer. We introduced the medieval tradition of calendar imagery, which has roots in classical antiquity. This imagery depicted the seasonal labours associated with each month, following the agricultural cycle, and was often paired with the zodiac symbols, as we can see here. We discussed how representations of the labours evolved from individual figures depicting the labours, such as those found on ancient friezes, to more expansive landscape scenes, from books of hours in the medieval period to landscape paintings in the early modern period. Although our panel appears to be possibly of the early modern era, it rather uniquely returns to this earlier mode from antiquity of depicting the labours as characterised figures. As we have established, we are aware of 2 other calendar series, very close compositional parallels to our panel, both of which have been attributed to 16th century Flemish artist Peter Bolton, who was born around 1527 and died in 1584 in Antwerp. The May and June panels from both series show very close compositional parallels to ours. Moving forward, we will be referring to them by their current locations, Portugal and Paris respectively, for clarity. This afternoon, we will be delving further into this imagery of the flower bearer and the sheep shearer of our panel within the context of the labours of the month, and we will consider the possible relationship to the Portugal and Paris paintings. In our last presentation, Sam characterised our painting's conditions and how the tool marks on the back are consistent with 16th century panel making techniques. This afternoon, we will intersperse the results of Sam's technical examination with an art historical perspective.
So first today, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the artist's techniques. Photomicrographs, or literally photos from the microscope, will allow close examination of the paint surface. like here at the sheep shearer's thumb, and this can tell us a lot about how the artist applied the paint. Here we can see some wet in wet brushstrokes, those little flicks at the end, which is where the artist has quickly applied more layers in still wet paint. This is a lovely detail of the sheep shearer's eye, where again you can see the quick, decisive brushstrokes and get a sense of the layer structure. On the cuff of May's sleeve, you can see some very delicate impasto making up the lace detailing. The painting is largely painted in very thin, wet and wet brushstrokes, so this detailing is really the only amount of delicate impasto on the painting. Microscopy can also tell us a bit about the order of the layer structures. In this area, where the sheep's eye meets the red vest, you can see that the black background bit was painted before the sheep, and then that red brushstroke overlaps both the black layer and the sheep's eye a little bit. So this is just an overall top-down raking light photo, which allows you to see the texture of the painting. So in this light, you can particularly see the wood grain, showing how thin those paint layers are. Now, before I go more into the materials and the condition, we're going to talk a little bit more about the iconography that you're looking at.
Traditionally, the high summer months were most represented by scenes of haymaking. As calendar cycles developed into landscape scenes, shepherding was represented in background details throughout the year and in a more central position for depictions of early spring, releasing the sheep for winter, or high summer, shearing. It is primarily in the late 15th to early 16th century that we find sheep shearing to represent June, as we see here in our panel, becoming a popular alternative for the haymaking of June and July. In many contemporary representations of peasant life, we may observe peasants in brightly coloured and vivid clothing, signifying the growing prosperity of Flanders during this period. Peasantry and rural labour was recognised as highly important for economic development. In the 14th century, an idealized country life aesthetic, particularly the pastoral, became fashionable in courtly life, which influenced the development of this imagery. And this sentiment may be observed beyond painting. For example, in the Antwerp Songbook, published in 1544, one song is entitled "Of the Noble Peasant," praising the peasant and encouraging gratitude and respect for peasant labour. The peasant came to symbolize a kind of universal idea. Their dignity was tied to a vision of humanity shaped by order and virtue. The rhythm between their labour and the natural seasons was seen as emblematic of a well-ordered society. These peasant scenes thus didn't function merely to reflect real rural life, but rather to offer a symbolic model of social balance. Here in our panel, the artist has compressed the labour of shearing into the small space afforded by a half-length portrait. They placed a small lamb coddled in the figure's arms and used this as an opportunity to bring his arms and hands up to display the sheep shears. Beside him is Our Lady May, perhaps the most captivating of the two figures as she directly gazes at the viewer. The spring months, such as May, are of course emblematic of renewal and regeneration of nature. It appears that the flower bearer is most often representative of April. However, the imagery of each month certainly varies across calendars. However, what is consistent is in representations of the annual cycle is that it begins with the winter months spent indoors, then work begins in early spring. But during April and May, when spring reaches full bloom, there is a pause in labour to honour and to celebrate the new abundance of flora. Spring and the flower bearer also came to represent courtship. The renewal of nature thus evolved to represent the renewal of humankind. Thus, in many representations of May, we see couples leisurely walking together through the garden, and this tradition certainly would have been recognised in this portrait of May with her rosebud. This association of May with courtship may have also been influenced by the Gemini sign, which we see here, though rooted in a narrative of twins, with Gemini meaning twins in Latin. The astrological sign was in the Middle Ages occasionally represented as lovers embracing one another. The pennant in her hand, though it has not been identified, most likely signifies a particular festivity associated with May, such as May Day, and this would connect to an original purpose of the calendar and the representation of the legs of the months within the books of hours, which was to mark the important dates of each month. Lady May wears a stiffened black bodice with a high neckline and blackwork embroidery or detailing, an elaborate open ruff collar, and yellow sleeves with a persimmondary trim. She also wears an attifet, a piece of headwear, usually made of silk or linen, held in this shape by a wire frame. Her dress is consistent with 16th century attire that we see represented in other contemporary paintings, and a consideration of some of these even more detailed portraits further reveals the possible structure, texture, and materials of her attire. Here we have two particularly similar examples from the 1560s and the 1580s. In this portrait of a young woman to the right, we see a very similar dress and attifet, and a particularly noticeable shared feature here is the markings on the sleeves of the sleeves. To the left, in this portrait of Margaret of Parma, who was governor of the Netherlands, we see an example of this open ruff, and again, similar colouring in the clothing. In many portraits from the time, we see that the open ruff is usually considerably smaller than the closed ruff. However, the size of the open ruff in our portrait seems to be more a stylistic decision by the artist. As you can see, many of her features are considerably large when compared to her torso. As has been the subject of much scholarship, in the late 15th and early 16th century, Antwerp emerged as a leading art centre and economic capital of Northern Europe. The city's prosperity, bolstered by rich maritime trade and financial networks, attracted crowds of foreign merchants, as well as artists from across the Netherlands and beyond. The Guild of St. Luke had seen a steady rise of incoming artists from the 1460s to 1550s especially, who established large workshops to supply the expanding market for the production and export of art. The Guild regulated art production and divided labour, involving multiple artisans collaborating on a single work. A panel maker specialised in carpentry would create the wooden panel, carefully joined and prepared to avoid warping. Workshop apprentices might engage in menial work, including grinding pigments and preparing brushes. In some commissions, they might paint backgrounds, drapery or architecture, following a master's cartoon or drawing. Then a master painter would be responsible for the composition, design, and the most significant parts of the painting, such as faces, hands, and other focal points. Finally, a specialist in still life, landscapes or gold leaf gilding, for example, might be brought in for a particular task. And Sam will now take you through the production of our painting.
So this is the infrared reflectogram. Infrared reflectography can help us detect any carbon-containing underdrawing due to its absorption of infrared wavelengths. This type of underdrawing is often seen in imagery produced by these kinds of workshops due to the nature of repeating images and working from cartoons. However, in our imagery, no clear carbon underdrawing appears, so we're going to move on into the layer structure. So to understand the pigments and the structure, we sometimes take microscopic paint samples from existing damages. This is the normal light and the ultraviolet light photomicrographs of the cross-section, which I took from a loss in the yellow sleeve. Now this is just a bit for scale. These samples are measured in micrometers. I took this sample to King's College for analysis called scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, which is much more easily known as SEM-EDX. Put very simply, this allows incredibly detailed imaging of the surface topography and detection of the elements present. We can also then generate false color maps that show you where those elements are located. So, this allows us to characterize each layer. So in the ground layer here, we found calcium. This is likely calcium carbonate or chalk because it can be identified by the presence of prehistoric marine nanofossils, like these calospheres, which are on the right. The more nanofossils, the finer the chalk. And these grounds were traditionally used in 14th to 17th century Flemish panel painting as they could lend luminosity to the paint layers. There is an incredibly fine layer of multicolored particles just above that ground layer. It's not its own discrete layer, but the elemental mapping suggests that some may be iron-containing. So they could be some kind of underdrawing or underpainting using iron-containing earths, although it doesn't appear to be a full imprimatur layer. Next, the lower paint layer appears to be lead tin yellow, and you can see on the right some false color maps. Up top is lead, and underneath is tin. Again, this was frequently used in the 15th to the 17th centuries. Finally, the top paint layer is that grayish-brown decoration on her sleeves, but the pigment is actually smalt, which is a cobalt potassium glass. So you can see, again, the false color elemental map for silicon. In the top UV detail, up to the right, this is a detail of showing the characteristic shape of the very coarsely ground particles. Now, smalt is known to discolor like this, so the patterning would have been closer to blue originally, most likely. So from the cross-section and other non-invasive elemental analysis, this is the potential palette. The shrubbery is a type of copper-containing grain. Verdigris is also known to discolor over time. There are iron-containing earths, which in the hat appears to be umber, and the red is vermilion, or mercury sulfide. All of these pigments are also consistent with the proposed date. So when I took this cross-section, I purposely tried to include some of the previous restoration to better understand the layer structure. There appears to be a small loss in the original paint layers, this is the detail of. And so you can see a layer of what looks like dirt just above the original paint, and then a sort of grayish chalk fill. There's then a layer of varnish which fluoresces very brightly. There's a concentration of chlorine in this layer, which could potentially indicate that it's a bleached shellac. Shellac tends to be an orangey brown, so it wasn't traditionally associated with picture varnishing until methods for decolorizing or bleaching it were introduced in the 19th century, resulting in its promotion as a picture varnish. Indeed, a Paris-based company actually developed a retouching varnish, which has now been chemically identified as bleached shellac. And above that, you can see that there's a thin, pale yellow layer, with some very fine blue and white particles inside it. This appears to be a mix, but Naples yellow is identifiable from the presence of lead and antimony, as well as zinc. Both the underlying varnish and these pigments on top from the overpaint are consistent with potentially application from the 19th century or after, and then there's a final varnish layer up top. This is consistent with the observations I've made while I've been cleaning, because we are all treating these paintings as well as doing this project. So here's my halfway varnish removal photo. I've also begun to remove some of the visually disturbing overpaint. I've been able to identify 3 varnish layers, at least 4 overpaint layers, and some unknown coatings. So here's my halfway ultraviolet light photo, and you can kind of more clearly see the lines of where I've gotten up to with the cleaning based on the varnish's fluorescence. And here's just a detail of May's hands, so you can see the color difference. So obviously varnish on the left and my cleaning on the right. This is before and after I removed an area of some of that overpaint and fill in June's shirt. And there was a small damage down to the panel. Not only is it discolored, but the overpaint was covering original paint as well, so I'll be uncovering that as much as I can during cleaning. And this is just to give you an idea, because sometimes after the old varnish is removed, the paint looks a little desaturated. So on the right, this is just to give you an idea of what the paint might look like with the varnish again. So as well as the small damages, part of the reason there seems to be so much overpaint are these small black protrusions across the picture plane. This one is actually situated right in the middle of the flower, but having a series of small black dots across the painting can be distracting. These protrusions are likely lead soaps. Metal soaps, or metal carboxylate salts, are a common phenomenon which, put very simply, form from interactions between fatty acids in the binding medium and metal ions in the pigments. So the final type of overpaint I found reinforced or added some very minor elements. This red squiggle, for lack of a better word, pattern on June's sleeves looked a little odd from the beginning, but microscopy and starting the cleaning process allowed me to unpack all these layers much more easily. So I do think these red lines were added relatively early on in the restoration history, but they were hard to characterize because they are semi-translucent, and there was another unoriginal red washy layer added on top. But you can see in this photomicrograph that those red lines actually pass over this small damage to the original vermilion. It's also more clear after varnish removal because you can kind of see that it's covering up those pre-existing cracks in the vermilion, which suggests they were added after the damage and the cracks had already occurred naturally. So Technical examination so far has indicated that the materials and techniques in this painting are consistent with 16th century Flemish, or at minimum, Northern European panel painting. As for its physical history, I found several layers of overpaint fill across the picture plane. But I must emphasize that these are all local areas, meaning that none of the original composition has been substantially changed or covered. A restoration history like that can be expected in an artwork of this age. So now that I've explained the materials, techniques, and conditions of the painting, we're going to talk about its relationship to the comparable series.
As we discussed in our last presentation, all three versions share similar poses, dress, and inscriptions. However, other details vary. Allegory of May and June appears more similar to the Paris version, stylistically and compositionally. Key features include the use of both months on the same panel and the inclusion of the zodiac symbols. The inscriptions on Allegory and Paris series also bear greater similarities in the style of the lettering and more specifically the shared dots over the eyes, as seen on the right. Although, interestingly, it is the Paris series that has misspelled Unios, which you can see here at the bottom left, is missing an eye. All three portraits are linked by the grey-brown patterning on May's sleeves. As Sam has discussed, technical examination shows that this patterning is painted in smalt on our panel. This suggests it was a blue which has discoloured, as smalt is known to do over time. The other two series may also have smalt, which has discoloured to grey-brown. However, if our panel were a much later copy of that feature, the detailing might more likely have been rendered in a brown pigment instead of the smalt. Another key feature is the white details on this passementerie trim, as they are only shared between our painting and the Paris panel. Thus, everything we have discussed indicates that our panel cannot practically be a version or a copy based on the Portugal panel and is more likely related to the Paris panel. While we cannot determine if Allegory of May and June is an earlier or later version, or whether it is from the same workshop or not, we can confirm that all materials and techniques are consistent with those of a 16th century Flemish panel painting. The art historical and technical evidence that we have gathered and integrated into this project provide wonderful insight into the origins and physical history of the painting, which will also provide useful comparative data if the painting from the full calendar cycle still exists in our world.
All right, does anyone have any questions?
I've got two questions, but the one that is related to the last, the relationship between the different series. Do we know anything about their physical history, where they were historically?
Well, quite a significant amount of research has been done on the Portugal panel painting, which belongs to a cathedral in Portugal and was purchased by a bishop probably in the early 17th century.
So they have more records from the cathedral, meaning that essentially the research on that suggests that he may have commissioned it or purchased it specifically for the church, but that it was still produced in Flanders. And then the Paris one, that has less information. There's been a lot of research on sort of within Portugal on their series, but the Paris panels, we weren't able to get as much information, including attribution, although there's been an old publication that details a bit about them, that lists them as Peter Bolton's work, but we couldn't confirm any more than that, how that attribution is decided. And then I do know we weren't able to access, but I believe there was some sort of technical examination and treatment on the Portugal series from a studio in Portugal. So if at any point we could see that, it would be great to have a comparison, but not within this time frame.
And another interesting insight on the research of the Portugal panel is regarding the pennants. They weren't able to identify that pennon either, but in all of the 3 panel paintings that pennants differ, and the research done by on the Portugal panels, they suggested that it may have been specific to that commission.
Which would make sense. Yeah. Same question.
I was just wondering about, in comparison to the other cycles of calendar paintings, if you have any thoughts on why your set of figures looks a bit more carefully and sort of perhaps beautifully rendered in comparison to the sort of more graphic depictions in the others. I don't know if your research sort of stretched to that.
Yeah, it was definitely something we noticed, and something we went into a little bit more last time. We did say our figures seem to have a sort of more delicate nature especially to the facial features, but even just to the shape and some of the other details. So we're not entirely sure. We haven't found anything specifically that would give us a solid reason. And obviously we can't completely say how it relates. We don't know whether it was first or after, or which workshop, if it was the same one. But it is actually something we still are wondering.
Yeah, and also the Portugal and Paris series also seem more closely related than they are with our panel. For example, the double rosebud as well, and also kind of the style, I think, as well. So we definitely noticed that, but we haven't conclusively been able to define why.
Because you're right, the Portugal series and the Paris series, in terms of the actual figures, they are more similar. It's just that there are certain elements that are more closely, obviously, linked in ours and the Paris, which, those have to be more closely related just because of that. In terms of the style, I'm not sure. I do think in the research about the Portugal one, it was suggested that the Portugal series is a secondary version of the Paris one, that it did come after and was painted, I think, it was maybe suggested that it was painted slightly differently for that commission, but obviously that was, can't substantiate that, but it's a theory. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Really simple one, actually. I'm not sure. But your one, is it the same size as the Paris series?
No. So it's not quite the same dimensions. I had a lovely long think about this because it seems to vary because one's a double portrait and the other ones are singles. They seem to vary how they list what size they are. The research on the Portugal one seemed to say that the Portugal and the Paris were the same size when you put the 2 singles together, but it doesn't quite correspond with the size of ours. They are similar, but ours is 37 by 47, and the other ones are just a little bit off of that. So it's not a massive difference, but not exactly the same. And not enough, it's not small enough of a difference that it could have just been the panel changing shape over time or anything like that. Any other questions? No? Okay. All right. So thank you all for listening, and we are going to introduce the next pair, which is Kay and Nayla.
Hello everyone. Thank you for coming to the second presentation of our painting pairs research. So this is the one where we will tell you a bit more about the results we have found. So I'm the History of Art student and Kay is in the Conservation department. A bit about what we have said in the first presentation, just to remind people or to tell you about, if you haven't been there yet, what is art painting. Art painting is quite peculiar because it is a picture clock. It's a 19th century picture made on canvas, and it has a hole in it, as you can see, and it would have been used to put the clock in it. So the clock is embedded in the picture, and this is more clear with that slide. The tunes playing would have been very important because it would have played music every hour or so, depending on the settings you put, and then it would have open from the bottom up, and as you can see, there's a sort of there's a sort of box where the mechanism lays. It came from a private collection, and the painter is unknown, and as you can see, it's a landscape, an idealistic landscape, and that's typically the French picture clock style. So our research question that we introduced in the first presentation was, were these ones so first, who owned the picture clocks, why there was this specific painting, how the painting was produced, and where it came from. I'm going to start with understanding the importance of the painting and landscape. And to do that, I want to underline how landscape in the 19th century was considered a minor genre compared to, for example, historical paintings that were more notable, and picture clocks were often more important in terms of clocks and music than for the painting itself. So it is surprising to think that French picture clocks had landscape and not landscapes and not something else, like the Germans, for example. So the German picture clocks depicted architecture and really precise architecture, and so the reason why there is a painting overall is because of this tradition that came from Germany of Bilderburen clocks from the early 19th century, and also the tradition of automatons that were paintings that were mechanical paintings. So this is the one on the left, and the one on the right is a Bilderburen, so a picture clock that is German. And the reason why it would have had a landscape is because the bourgeoisie actually had a lot of landscapes in their homes because they were cheaper than historical paintings, for example. So that leads me to a second question, which is who would have owned the paintings? And the reasons are, the response for that question is multiple, depending on the use and the time. So before the 1850s, the picture clocks were owned by the aristocracy more than the petite bourgeoisie. It could have been a precious object actually, because we have evidence of a picture clock, which is, and you can see it written on the right catalog, the sale catalog, which is a picture clock that was made by 8 famous artists in France and given to someone of the high bourgeoisie called Monsieur Consul. And they could have been also part of a larger collection and just bought by big collectioners, and that is the second example on the left, a cell catalog registering picture clock from the collection of the Duke of Courtauld, who also had a Veronese, for example, so that gives you an idea of how big of a collectioner he was. And then after the 1850s and the second half of the 19th century, I suppose that with the explosion of purchasing power in the 1840s and the decline of quality in the 1870s of the mechanism and the picture clocks overall, the price dropped. It's crazy because you have an example of that in the screenshot of that Le Courrier du Gard, which is just they're selling picture clocks for 50% off because it's getting so cheap. It's 24 francs, but it would have been 2 times that without music, and with music it's 45 francs, which is about 91 euros for 24 francs. So that gives you an idea. And then there's a lot of literature that registers a form of scorn and despise against picture clocks, and they're not anymore this high-end aristocracy good that you can buy. It's now very much looked down upon, and there's an example of that in Mécanique Appliquée by Charles Gaumont, where he says that picture clocks are actually nonsense from another age. And that gives you an idea of how mentality evolves through time and how collections might have changed. So I think that from 1860s or 1850s, it's no longer the elite, but the petite bourgeoisie that would have had this picture clocks. And before I give her turn, I wanted to say that the production might have been I think the painting might have been ordered by the clockmakers, and then mechanism was made in a different timeline. We have evidence of a mechanism that was made 8 years before the painting was made, and so it was a whole different. I think it was a whole different process, and very divided. So now I'll leave you the floor.
So one of the main goals of our research was to discover more about how the painting was made, looking at its physical aspects and history, to try to contextualize the painting that we were studying within the wider history of picture clocks, which we've sort of discussed, and seeing how it falls, whether it was earlier or later in the century. But for the materials of the canvas is a commercially prepared size 25 French canvas, which you can see by the canvas stamp on the verso of the painting, which was increasingly common over the 19th century. Artist material suppliers offered different levels of expense for their prepared canvases. The Lefranc catalog on the right side of the slide shows the choices and prices for commercial canvases that they produced. And although the fabricant of our canvas is unknown, many of the materials offered were generally comparable, but prices varied between its suppliers. Notably on the catalog, towards the top you can see that the canvases could come in an ordinary or a more open weave, or a fine weave, with the fine weave being offered at a higher cost. And the strainers, which is slightly lower, were available as ordinary or with keys. So the expandable strainers or stretchers were almost twice as expensive as the ordinary strainers. The painting that we studied appears to have been the more inexpensive option, as it is an open weave canvas and stretched on an ordinary strainer. So the economy of the materials used in painting is an indication of the quality and could indicate the time period in which the painting was made, the later era. To find out more about the painting's production, I also took samples from the painting to examine the layer structure. So in this cross-section, which I've chosen as fairly representative of the other sections that I also found, the most prominent feature is the thick layer of ground and priming. I took in the sample for further elemental analysis at King's College to use their scanning electron microscope. And the false color elemental maps in the bottom right corner of the slide show the distribution of elements which we interpret to represent different materials and pigments. The elemental analysis shows a large chalk and lead white ground with a final preparatory priming layer of lead white. The ground preparation was popular in the second half of the 19th century and was supposed to be a non-absorbent preparation that was popular amongst colored men in France. In addition, the thick preparatory layers of this non-absorbent technique creates a smooth surface that is more or less free from canvas texture. The other important feature to note on this cross-section is the extremely thin paint layer. In all the samples I took, the paint layer is similarly thin, and this would suggest that the painter was trying to be economical in the paint that they used by executing the painting in as little paint as possible. Further elemental analysis of the paint layer suggests that pigments were also cost efficient, and the painting was largely done in earth pigments, Prussian blue, and vermilion, which are either low cost or have high tinting strength, meaning that a large amount of paint could be tinted with a relatively small amount of pigment. And looking closely at the painting with photomicrographs, the figures and architecture are done very efficiently with very few brush strokes, but the effect is quite convincing of what it's supposed to be depicting. There's also very little evidence of built-up paint, which would suggest that the artist did not rework the painting. The artist was likely quite proficient in painting and was probably not an amateur. To also understand more about how the composition was made, I used infrared reflectance, which helped find preparatory drawings and underlayers in the final paint layer. Materials commonly used for underdrawing, primarily charcoal, contain carbon, which is highly absorbent of infrared wavelengths. And in our painting, the subtle lines around the architecture appear to be underdrawing to plan the buildings and composition. On the slide, the red arrows are pointing to the lines of drawing, and the normal light photos below show how the original drawing has changed. The use of drawing to plan a composition would have been common practice, especially given the calculated economic manner of the paint layer. The possible technique in planning the composition would have been the use of landscape reference books, which you can see on the left side of the slide, which were rising in popularity in France during the 19th century, coinciding with the rise of academic painters indulging the landscape genre. There were several new publications aimed at painting students and amateurs alike, and these treatises often outlined principles of composition, while others, like the one on the slide, provided generic buildings and trees that could be inserted or mixed and matched as the artist needed. So these mixed and matched art books aided creation of fictional landscapes, as our painting is most likely a fictional landscape. So something like this could have been used in the planning of our composition. And finally, another major research question for us was the origin of the painting, as there appeared to be several influences in many different versions of painted clocks. After some discussions with the owner, we began to look into the construction of the frame and case to indicate the place of origin. The frame that the painting sets in is constructed similarly to other clocks produced in the Franche-Comté region in eastern France. This region was known for its major factories producing large amount of clock mechanisms and components during the 19th century. The clocks shown here are pendule moire, go by many names, including pendule à tableau, vineyard clocks, and oeil de boeuf. In some cases, these clocks were ornamentally decorated with mother and pearl inlay, but could also have painted backgrounds. And strikingly similar to our painting, these clocks' frames and decorations could hinge up and be propped open, leaving the clock face and mechanism attached to the back of the case. The construction of the cases is likewise similar, with thick wooden walls and planks creating backing. The similarity of construction is potentially evidence of both of these clocks being made in the same early industrial factories in eastern France. Although the picture clocks, like the one we studied, appear to be only popular on the Parisian market and were less popular or less financially accessible to other regions in France, unlike the other Comtoise clocks, which were more popular regionally. Additionally, the mechanism in our clock is a Japy make, which would have originated in eastern France. So all evidence that we could find sort of places that as the point of origin.
Looking at what is depicted, you can see in the foreground that there's a house that is very similar to what is to architecture in east of France and in Swiss Romandy, which is the region where French is spoken. So everything kind of looking at that, you can see it as something that is at least additional evidence of regional or possibly inspiration on that region. another element was the watermill in the foreground, which is typical of Natter watermill in Romandy, which is also the same part in Swiss. So that gives us an idea of where the painting could have come from, or what the inspiration was. So now we can continue.
We'll just have some conclusions on what we found and talk about some potential areas of further research. But much of what we've been able to find still remains to be studied further, as most of what we have can be further done. The painting we studied is clearly in a long tradition of painted clocks, starting from the 18th century aristocracy and cabinets of curiosities. But they're also related to the initial picture clocks on canvas or panel, which are originally seen in southern Germany and appeared to quickly influence other regions. Our clock seems to have been produced near the end of the evolution of picture clocks, in the period of the quality and reputation of picture clocks declining in the second half of the 19th century. The materials and painting techniques of our painting support the extreme cost efficiency of the painting and marking their fall from the public renown. That's not to say that picture clocks are not important to study, as they represent a very interesting case study in both early factory production and the changing economic markets of the 19th century in Paris. More research can be done to confirm our initial evaluation of a late 19th century picture clock, and further study into commissioning of paintings would also be helpful for more thoroughly understanding where the paintings came from and who painted them. And we would just like to have some acknowledgements for Jonathan Betts and people at the Clock Museum in St. Nicolas, and the tutors as well for helping, and the research forum for this research opportunity. A little bit of bibliography, but at this point, if there are any questions.
You mentioned that the clock, you believe the clock was predated the portrait, I believe, and I was wondering what evidence, what led you to that conclusion?
It's actually an example that I found. It's not that the clock would have always predated the picture. It's just I found in an article that I read, it was said that the mechanism dated in the 1840s, but the painting was made in 1848. So that just shows you how it's not a production that happens at once, but maybe in different states. Yes.
Hi, thanks very much. It was really interesting. I've never seen a painting like this before. And I was just wondering, does the clock also require restoration? And if so, are you kind of collaborating with somebody?
I believe it might, but it belongs to the owner, and I think the owner is taking care of that. That's far beyond my capabilities as a painting conservator.
In your researches, have you found any other of the paintings which have a signature at all? And the second question is, could you comment frankly on the quality of the painting itself and the ability of the artist? Because I suspect it's fairly low down in the order of things at Courtauld.
Yeah, there's evidence of paintings of these picture clocks that are signed, and you can see sort of old auction lots with them present. So it's not that it was never done, it just seems that it was not hugely common, and they appear to be more in the German or Austrian school that were signed, whereas our French and Swiss ones very rarely have signatures. And the painting itself, I I want to reiterate that I think it's very well done for what it is. I don't think it's not hugely complicated. It's very simple, but it's very effective. It's very minimal brushstrokes, but it is convincing in what it's trying to depict. You can clearly see what it is. So while it's not, in the caliber of other paintings, I think it is still a very solid painting.
I have a question. Did you get a chance to see any of these clocks and musical things working? Making the sounds or the music? And the second question that's not necessarily related to that is, how does the construction and the fact that this has got a dual purpose, how does that influence your approach to conservation and painting?
Yes, we were able to go up to Belmont House in Kent, which has some of these picture clocks. Not exactly like the one that we have, but they are very similar, and we were actually able to get them wound and working, so it was very interesting to see them hung on a wall and actually making a sound. So it's a nice experience, I think. Do you have anything to add on that point before I move on to the next one?
Oh, not really.
Okay.
You did well.
And yeah, it was also in that trip. I think seeing them up on the wall and seeing how they hinge open and seeing all of the elements put together is very helpful for me going forward with my treatment, because seeing that in context, even though it's not exactly the same, will definitely inform how I approach the painting that I'm working on and that we were researching, as understanding all the different elements all put together.
Can you go further?
in anything in particular, or?
Yeah. You're the restorer.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's the question of lining, which is the big elephant in the room, I think, in all of our discussions of the painting, and understanding how important it is to remain for the canvas to remain stable at the movement of it being hinged up and down and servicing, and so that definitely will. It has helped me think about moving forward with a decision.
And just to follow on from Jonathan's question, really, I just wondered whether you'd looked. I mean, I think this is. I think, as you say, this is very, very proficient painting, and it is very effective. And so I just wondered whether you could comment on the effect of cleaning the painting and what that's achieved, and also whether post-cleaning now, are you able to relate the style in which this is painted and the painting technique more closely to any others that you see?
Yeah. So I didn't mention it during the talk, but at the very start there was an image of it before treatment, and this image that you see now is after the varnish has been removed, and a significant amount of dirt has also been removed alongside of it. So the colors and the clarity of the composition is much improved. You can understand a lot more about the painting and the figures in it. I think especially in the architecture, being able to see the way that the architecture has been changed since the varnish was removed. You can see a lot more of the white of the buildings, and the different architectural elements are much clearer. So that has been hugely beneficial in looking at and comparing it to other architectural elements that we were able to identify in Switzerland and the Alpine region in France.
There's also, you were talking about if we could compare it to other picture clocks in style. There's a lot of elements that are similar, and I think it comes from the idea that there has to be movement in the painting. For example, there's always water rushing down somewhere and people walking by. I mean, it's fairly peaceful, but there is still a small idea of movement in the painting, and I think that comes from the automaton tradition. But also, if you're looking at earlier picture clocks, there's definitely elements that are similar. I don't know in style and in in terms of just recurring themes.
Now that you've seen the clocks working, have you found a relationship between the pictures and the music?
No, I don't actually believe that there is a very direct reference between music and the.
Yeah, there isn't in ours, I believe, but the owner, Jonathan Betts, told us that some picture clocks might have had echo, so if you're in a valley, and if it's depicting a valley, and then the sound plays, and it plays twice to
mimic the echo of hearing it against the mountains.
yes.
So little things like that, but I think on the whole, they're just nice tunes to hear alongside of it. But you could change, you could add tunes or sort of kind of customize how many musical elements that were in the clock.
And the more you add, the more expensive it is. So yeah. Other questions?
Hi, sorry, I was just going to quickly ask about the strainer, because it's kind of interesting in the way it's built up. And is this similar to other strainers that were produced at the time, or is this specific to clock painting?
I'm not sure exactly how specific it is to clock paintings, but it is interesting that many other clock paintings, especially around the similar size, have those diagonal crossbars, which that style was common for French strainers and structures at the time, but they were usually sort of inset in the frame and would have been in the same plane, whereas these are on top of the strainer. I did find reference to a catalog for moving paintings and different add-ons to canvases and cases that would be helpful with paintings that would experience high vibrations and a lot of movement when you're moving collections. And in that catalog, I found mention of these angles of security, which I believe the description matches of this, of being added onto the face of it, rather than being inset like normal crossbars. And so that could be one precaution that either the clockmakers or added or were ordering as additions onto their strainers, because the clocks had such high mobility and they would experience a lot of not impacts, but vibrations over the course of their lives. And the vertical one, which protrudes quite a bit further out, could have been added as more or less as a handle for the painting, which is similarly mentioned in that in the same catalog of moving. So. Okay, next we will have Kat and Kivnia talk about the Amiga workshop doors. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Catherine Doherty and I'm the Conservation of Easel Paintings student.
And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Katie Mir-Diamandi and I'm the MA History of Art student working on this Painting Pairs project. We'd like to begin our presentation by extending our thanks to Ben Angwin, Alexandra Gerstein, Aviva Bernstock, Pippa Bouch, Nathan Daly, Graham Barraclough, and Karen Sayers. Their support and advice have really helped this project soar. So these wonderful doors came to the Courtauld this summer, thanks to the research of Ben for his PhD on Omega's patronage. What are now two separate doors were originally part of one wardrobe, which were acquired at the Omega workshops, probably in 1919, by Mrs. Dorothy Hodgkinson, and then by descent to the owner, who then in turn gifted the doors to the Courtauld. In our last presentation, we took you through some of our initial thoughts and tests from an art historical and conservation perspective. And over the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to show you where our research has taken us over the past few months and some conclusions that we've come to. On this slide here, we have a photo of the Omega workshops at number 33 Fitzroy Square in London. You can really get a sense of the environment in which these doors were created. The Omega workshops are founded on the principle that all pieces will be sold kind of under the Omega collective, and what that means is that none of the Omega artists, I don't know if allowed is the right word, but basically they didn't put their signature on their pieces. They were kind of imprinted with the Omega stamp, which is actually the Greek Omega symbol. Figuring out which Omega artist made what has been a central preoccupation of Omega scholarship. We and a few other fantastic Omega experts think the doors were painted by Vanessa Bell, who was Virginia Woolf's sister. This is certainly a tentative attribution, but today we are going to be showing you some of our visual evidence to demonstrate how we came to our conclusion. Kat is now going to take you through some of the technical analysis performed on the doors, which have really helped further our understanding of workshop practice.
One of our questions about the doors was what kind of paint had been applied. Its matte appearance suggests it's water-based, which has implications for treatment, as aqueous cleaning systems or consolidants, for example, could pose a risk to the paint. Some initial research of similar Omega objects across different collections revealed that if the paint medium isn't oil, it's most often listed as painted wood, with no specific medium identified. This signals a real gap in the knowledge with respect to Omega materials. So undertaking medium analysis was really important for furthering this knowledge. The first step was to do a staining test, which would reveal or rule out the presence of oil or protein. We thought maybe protein would be present, considering the paint looked like distemper, which is basically made up of animal glue, chalk, pigment and water. This test involved taking a small paint sample, which we took from the yellow dress near a damage, and mounted in resin to view in cross-section under the microscope. The micrograph shows the white ground layer below the yellow paint layer. The top right image shows the stain for oil using rhodium B, which should have a characteristic pink or orange stain if present, and the image on the bottom right shows the stain for protein with amido black, which will stain a dark blue if positive, as has happened for both in the ground layer, which could have been caused by its absorbency, which might be a confounding factor, or they might be present. However, the paint layer did not stain positively for either, which was informative and prompted further analysis. We then performed FTIR, which stands for Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy, which can be used to identify organic material. For those who aren't familiar with FTIR, it's an absorption technique whereby infrared light is absorbed at specific frequencies related to particular bond energies in a molecule. A spectrum is produced from these absorption bands, creating a characteristic fingerprint of the molecule. The spectrum can then be compared with a spectral reference library of known materials. So the black line here is the spectrum for our sample, which shows a close match with the spectrum for gum arabic. We can't say gum arabic for certain using this technique, but it's a very close match with gums generally, and from this we can infer that the paint is likely gouache or poster paint. Both are documented in many Omega designs on paper, either listed as gouache or body colour. With this in mind, we compared the different types of paint used by different Omega artists in both attributed Omega works and their personal practices to see if any trends could be identified. However, the lack of information about the paint media made this challenging. These images show just some examples of unidentified paint on furniture. However, there are a few works of interest. For this screen on the left, painted by Bell for the Omega, distemper is identified, and Duncan Grant records in an interview in Tate's archive that the tub by Bell was painted in gouache. Tate also had some technical reports on two of Grant's paintings. Both are predominantly oil paint, but casein was found in the underpainting of the ass and in the priming of bathing. While these paintings are less stylistically relevant, it's useful to begin building a picture of the types of paints used by different artists. I also made a trip down to Charleston, which is the house Bell and Grant moved to more permanently in 1916. Bell and Grant decorated the house in the Amoeba fashion, which has been preserved and is now open to the public. It's a real time capsule with old writing desks and photographs and painted furniture everywhere, and you really get a sense for these artists' unusual lifestyles. In the shared studio space, there was a table of materials including oil paints and pastel sets from Paris. Crucially, there were little paint pots labelled as poster colour. Much of the furniture there looked to be painted in a water-based paint, quite possibly done using this poster colour. While none of this yields anything conclusive, what we can extrapolate is that these artists were using all sorts of paints in their personal work and likely at Omega. Medium analysis on a larger sample of works might begin to reveal trends across different times or between individual artists. However, at this stage, there's not enough information to draw links to a particular artist. That leads us on to stylistic comparison. Whilst I was at Charleston, I found a very exciting object, which I'll briefly introduce before passing you over to Katie. Amongst the stores of materials in the studio room, there was a small wooden cabinet containing bottles of assorted oils and terps. On the inner door panels was this rather interesting design. The figures depict Adam and Eve and bear some striking resemblances to our doors, namely the inwardly inclined figures, particularly the bent head and clasped hands of the female figure, with simple straight lines for fingers. The parallel yellow brushstrokes on the bodies are very similar, and a rectangular motif also makes up the border. According to Charleston's records, these doors were painted in 1913 by Duncan Grant. We know that Grant and Bell were exceptionally close. They were friends, lovers, and worked closely on their artistic practices, so crossovers of designs make sense. For example, stylistic comparisons can be drawn between Grant's cupboard doors and Bell's painting the tub, such as the lines of the noses and eyebrows, and in the curved marks on the stomach to imply form. But this borrowing of ideas makes differentiating a hand for our doors an interesting challenge.
Virginia Woolf said of her sister Vanessa Bell's paintings that they give us emotion, they offer a puzzle. This has certainly been felt by both Kat and I whilst researching these wonderful but elusive wardrobe doors. One of the challenges with Omega attribution is that the artists in the workshop were incredibly versatile. They were inspired by such a wide variety of art historical sources, spanning from Byzantine mosaics to French post-impressionists. Finding inspiration from so many sources created the unique Omega style, and I say style hesitantly as Omega pieces show so much variety. This set of 8 paintings is a case in point. These muses were a collaborative project by Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell, and we can see how well their styles blend together in these compositions. Figurally, the muses are similar to the women on the doors, particularly the one dressed in all white. Compositionally, there are striking similarities to the doors, as each muse occupies their own framed rectangular space. The often seamless conjunction of ideas and styles in Omega pieces is really exemplified here, illustrating just how difficult and challenging attribution can be. I'm now going to take you through some visual evidence that we found really compelling whilst trying to attribute the doors to Bell. In the many conversations with Ben, Alexandra and Pippa in the Courtauld Conservation Studios, the question of who painted them continuously cropped up. What we found most compelling with regards to an attribution to Bell was the almond shape that we see in the heads, feet and hands of the figures on the wardrobes. Even the leaves that frame the 2 women create a sort of almond-shaped cove for them. This approach is inspired by the Morellian technique, which is named after an art historian called Giovanni Morelli. So what he did is he would identify an artist's style by memorizing really minute and unusual details. For example, the hands, ears or fingernails of a figure in a painting. He argued that that would distinguish a real from a fake and help art historians uncover lost artworks, because the way in which an artist paints ears, hands, fingernails is far more subconscious than the way that they paint a face, for example, so it was more indicative of their style and therefore harder to copy. This approach is somewhat challenging to apply to Omega pieces because all the artists were so inspired by one another and would call upon each other's work. However, when we look at Bell's work, the almond shape becomes distinguishing of her style. We can see this when we compare her dancing couple with Winifred Gill's sketches of dancers. Although conjectural, we can suggest that Gill was inspired by Bell's couple and called upon her design in 1916. A less angular version of these almonds can be seen here in Gaudier-Bresca's Wrestlers. He moved to London in 1911 and met Nina Hammett in 1913. Hammett worked for the Omega Workshops and invited Gaudier-Bresca to join. He left in 1914 for the French army and was very unfortunately killed in the war, but the crossover between Bell and Gaudier-Bresca at the workshops could have inspired the painting of the wardrobe doors. The abstract figures that we see on the doors are also common in Duncan Grant's work, despite the almond shape being interpreted differently. Here we see two sketches of dancers inspired by the arrival of the Ballet Russe in London. Aside from the very endearing charm of the drawings, what captivated us was the stripes drawn onto the dancer's costume on the right, which may have inspired or been inspired by the wardrobe doors. Duncan Grant also dabbled in the same kind of anonymous yellow figures that we see on the doors. On this box, however, the style is different. The face of the figure is far more circular, and he even adds a little bit of hair to the top of their head. For Grant, scholars have picked up on Picasso as the inspiration for his yellow figures. In La Danse au Voile, Picasso paints a rather sensuous female nude, and this is translated to Adam and Eve's, Duncan Grant's Adam and Eve on the right, which really sadly was ruined in a flood at the Tate, so information and photos of it are really hard to come by. In terms of attribution, if we look at Grant's figures and compare them with Bell's, it becomes more apparent that Bell is likely behind our doors. Grant's figures are far more curvaceous and anatomically pronounced than any of Bell's women, and this is apparent in the figure of Eve. We can extend this discussion to Grant's dancers, where his women are voluptuous in figure and follow a more rounded head shape. When we think back to a few slides ago, when I showed Grant's lovely drawings of dancers, the versatility I was speaking about really comes into play. This illustrates just how hard attribution can be, and as a result, how tentative we must be with our conclusions. The difference between Grant and Bell's painting style is apparent. If we compare Virginia Woolf in a deck chair here with dancers, we can see that Grant's painting style uses kind of a large stipple, while Bell's strokes are longer and looser. Bell called this Grant's leopard technique, which we both really loved, presumably because he would spot paint onto the canvas with his brush. She endearingly describes trying this technique herself in 1912, and she encouraged Roger Fry to try it as well. She says he isn't at all happy in it, but is spotting away industriously in the hopes of getting at something in the end. The Virgin Mary held a prevalent place in Bell's artistic oeuvre. Here we can see a sculpture she created in 1915 next to her 1941 Nativity in Benwick Church. On the right, we see Bell modelling for the Virgin, suggesting that she felt some form of connection with the maternal figure. The left-hand sculpture presents so many similarities to the doors. The shape of the Virgin's head and arms mirrors the position of the women on the doors, and the lines that trace down the Virgin's mantle mirror the lines of the leaves that frame the women. The overall almond shape of the Virgin Mary sculpture perhaps represents a mandorla, a typically blue almond shape that frames the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ in Christian art. We can see two examples here. Last time, we spoke about how the dresses that are painting on the doors are one of our leads towards a Bell attribution. She introduced dressmaking to the Omega Workshops in 1915 and was inspired by Parisian fashion. She left the London workshops to move to Charleston in 1916. She did continue to make some Omega work to send to London, but this was on a much smaller scale. If the doors were painted by Bell, they may have been created in the very narrow time frame of the introduction of dressmaking and her leaving for Charleston. If we date the doors to 1916 onwards, their execution is unlikely to have been by Bell, but of course she may have helped design them. Whilst in the King's College archives, I came across these two photographic slides that were used by Roger Fry in one of his lectures. The slides have not yet been matched up with the lectures they belong to, but after reading Fry's handwritten notes, we think the slides came from a lecture on modern fashion. They are illustrations from French fashion books. On the right, the striped dress presents some striking similarities to the one Belle wore in the previous slide and the dresses painted on the doors. The slide on the left struck us for a slightly different reason. In our first meeting in front of the doors, Aviva had a theory that they showed the front and back of the same woman, a little like we see here on this photographic slide. Omega fabrics, fashion and dressmaking were inherently tied to Belle. In this lovely photograph of Nina Hammett and Winifred Gill in Omega fashion, they stand in front of a screen painted by Belle. Her babes in a landscape really showcases the almond shapes that we see on the doors. Aspiring to return to a more rudimentary lifestyle, in 1913 the Omega Group organised a tenting camp. This experience was documented by Belle in the paintings we see here. Stylistically, there are some notable similarities with the wardrobe doors. In summer camp, these abstract, anonymous figures are similar to those on the doors, and the stripes of green in the centre of the canvas is really reminiscent of the leaves that frame our figures. Drawing on themes of nature and the outdoors, her 1916 Nude with Poppies recalls the almond shapes, anonymous slender figures, and washy style that we see on the wardrobe. Whilst we are certainly drawn towards a Belle attribution, much of our evidence lies in visual analysis. Working on these doors has really deepened our knowledge on the Omega workshops, and it's exceptionally exciting to be able to contribute to their history.
I'll now just briefly share some thoughts on the door's physical history. In our last presentation, we showed this image of a lantern slide that's believed to have been taken by Roger Fry and became part of Frank Pick's collection of slides, now owned by the London Transport Museum. I went to view the slide to better understand what a lantern slide is and to see if any discoveries could be made. This is how it was necessary to view the slide, using a light box. With a magnifying glass, it's surprisingly detailed and in fine focus. What I hadn't realised before was that the white space around the doors is in fact clear glass, not the white around of the surrounding wall, so perhaps some of the wardrobe has been omitted. Either way, we can't be certain from this image that the doors had been divorced from the wardrobe at this stage. Looking more closely at the slide, we can see this thin strip of wood is coming away on the left door and is now missing entirely. It's hard to say why the top frame member is made of two pieces of wood. Perhaps it was added by the workshop at Omega to improve aesthetic balance, or perhaps it points to the manufacturing process to help secure the inner boards within the frame. However, we think it's more likely a marker of cheaply made furniture or perhaps old furniture. This aligns with what we know of Roger Fry's practices in the latter years of Omega. In a letter to Vanessa Bell in December 1918, he writes, "As we can't get furniture made, I've been buying old furniture and we are going to paint it up at the Omega." This might point to the reason the wood is separating so early in the door's lifetime, which we presume to be early considering the good condition of the paint. Also, with regard to this slide, there was the question of the stark contrasts of tonal values between rectangles. Having now had some time to look and better understand the layer structure of the paint, we think that the reason for this is that all the white rectangles correspond to the lighter green colour indicated by the arrows. Beneath the darker bluish rectangles, this light green is also present. These highlighted areas show where the lighter green is, which corresponds to the light areas on the lantern slide. This lighter shade was achieved using a mix of emerald green and white, while the muddier green was achieved by mixing chrome yellow into the mix. A really nice visualization of this is the image on the bottom right, showing the false colour map for chromium produced via macro XRF. This is a non-invasive technique used to detect and map the distribution of elements across a surface. It works by directing high-energy X-rays at the surface, which excites the electrons in the atoms, and the secondary fluorescent X-rays emitted when they return to the lower energy states is measured, which is unique for different elements. It can tell us what's present, and from this we can infer the pigments. The dark areas between rectangles show where the chrome yellow isn't, which corresponds to the light green colour. The middle image shows highlighted areas of retouching, evidenced by the overpaint filling paint losses. We think that the bluer rectangles have not been added when the lantern slide image was taken, but are still likely done by the workshop, as they do not fill losses and the paint medium appears very similar to the original. The stark tonal contrast is likely due to the emulsion sensitivities, which absorb different light frequencies, creating this contrast between the different greens. Unfortunately, the very helpful staff at the London Transport Museum don't know what kind of emulsion was used for this lantern slide, but it's possible it was made using the cheaper wet plate process, which was sensitive to blue and ultraviolet light, meaning that warm colours appear dark and cool colours appear light. The green containing chrome yellow is warmer, and the green containing only emerald green is cooler, providing some evidence for this.
To summarise, Kat and I are pretty convinced that the wardrobe doors were designed and or painted by Vanessa Bell. It is, however, difficult to draw a definite conclusion. If we were to do so, we would need some concrete evidence from a letter written by or to one of the artists, or perhaps a mention of the wardrobe in a lecture by Fry. Kat and I have both combed through the majority of Bell, Fry, Gill, Grant and Lewis's letters, with no success unfortunately. I've also been slowly combing through Roger Fry's lecture notes with no mention of the doors and surprisingly little mention of the Omega workshops. Stylistically, the doors conform to Bell's abstract style. If we are to attempt to date them, we would date them between 1914 to 1916, as larger Omega furniture started to be crafted in this period, as we can see from another excellent wardrobe by Roger Fry. Trying to find a reference to the doors is a far larger endeavour that is unfortunately outside of the scope of this project, but we are really confident that our research has propelled this wardrobe into the public eye and in a direction towards a Vanessa Bell attribution. Here are some of our references.
Thank you very much for listening. We will now
If anybody has any questions, please feel free.
It was a really good presentation, really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I was just wondering, you may have mentioned it in the last talk, but what conservation is the leather doors undergoing?
Oh yes, sorry, I didn't mention that this time. So I'm currently consolidating them. So I'm basically sort of getting glue behind the paint. It's really delaminating and flaking quite badly. There's lots of different types of loss. Some of it's caused by sort of damage from use, while a lot of it is caused by sort of inherent bias of the material. So the inner boards of the doors have shrunk quite considerably, and as they've shrunk, the sort of inflexible paint has sort of fractured and delaminated. So the first step is just to stabilise the paint, and then more thought and discussion needs to go into sort of how far to take retouching, and there's a question of sort of structural work.
Has your trip to Charleston helped kind of give some ideas for how far you might want to take the retouching?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that and kind of looking at other pieces of furniture in the V&A's collection as well, and they're all sort of presented to quite a high sort of level of finesse. And I suppose the only thing to think about with our doors is that they have been in a private residence for about 100 years, and that's quite an important part of his life. It's quite unusual that they've been used up until fairly recently, and I think that's a really important value to take into account in how far we take the retouching. I think that maybe different approaches to different types of losses could be taken. Maybe it could be taken further in the losses caused by the shrinkage, and maybe a toning approach could be taken just so that you can still view the image without it being, completely distracting, but so that it can be understood as, these were just used and they were kind of, not treasures in a way.
Thank you, I also really enjoyed that. I thought it was really thorough and some surprising pieces that just wondered if you had three questions. If you got all of it or try potential attribution, if there's
Yeah, I mean, from like the stylistic point of view, which I think we kind of we agree on. If you look at the way in which different Omega artists depict women and female figures, it's very different when you compare the men and the women. Not to say that Grant's female figures are representative of Roger Fry's, but there's actually a really lovely painting on the inside of a musical instrument that we didn't include in this presentation by Roger Fry. And like Duncan Grant, their women are very much more anatomically pronounced, curvaceous. They're calling upon a classical female nude to a greater extent than these are. So we're kind of we're pretty happy with the thought that a woman painted them, and also just with stylistic comparison, Roger Fry's painting technique seems it kind of seems like an in-between between Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, I would say, where we've got those different lengths of brushstrokes that typically define the two. So in terms of kind of slotting in stylistically with someone's broader herb, we were pretty convinced by Bell, but as I said, everything is so different with their mega pieces, and so really, there's no form of definite knowing unless they're mentioned somewhere, I suppose. But yeah, that's kind of our approach stylistically to that question.
I have two questions. One is just to do with the frame of the frame and
in the muses, actually, that's a really good. Thank you for bringing that up. In the kind of photos of the 8 muses of the arts and sciences that I showed, we showed pretty early on in the presentation, the women, a lot of them are on a background of the same kind of spotty marbling that we see on the frames of our wardrobe doors. And as they were a collaboration between Grant and Bell, there is that possibility that obviously that could happen here. If you see like in the background of the vast majority of them, there are a lot of like splodges in addition to squiggles, for lack of a better word. But yes, there's definitely that possibility that the main body of the wardrobe was designed and or painted by Bell, and then the frame done by someone else. Again, because there was so much collaboration, which is amazing when you think about how the workshops function on a day-to-day basis, but not so amazing for us trying to figure out who painted them, unfortunately.
There's also, just to add to that, there's also white, which she designed for fabric, and it has this, which I don't have a photo here, but it has the sort of rectangular tree form sort of as an outline, and then these kind of splodges over the top, which is kind of like a joining of those two designs, which was, I think, known to be by Bell. So, yeah.
Actually, those are interesting because we don't know exactly how they were printed, but they were printed in so many different colorways.
Mm.
Clearly, they used different. They were printed with one design and then overlapped with sort of transparent color print, and yeah, you're right, they merged. Just a question, sort of for Kat, but a kind of bigger question about materials in the Omega workshops. And do you think this is like an area of potential research? Is this something that's lacking?
Yeah, it's definitely an area of potential research. I would have quite liked to have done my third year project on it, but it was sort of tricky to organise. But there's definitely so much that could be researched. I think, as I said, I think if it's oil, it's fairly straightforward. It's more easy to identify. All the analysis has been done. And I was just quite shocked actually at how all these pieces just say painted wood or paint on wood. And it's just quite an interesting gap, really. So yeah, for sure, there's some room for research. Yeah. Thank you very much. We're now going to introduce Nitzan and Lara, who are presenting on their painting titled Portrait of Hannah Freeman.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying this long. I'm Lara, I'm the art historian in this pair.
And I'm Nitzan, and I'm the art conservation student in this pair. First, we'd like to start with just a brief recap to remind us all of where we left off with our research after session 1. So as you can see, this painting is titled Portrait of Hannah Freeman, the Last of the Essex Straw Platters by Felicia Covington. It's an oil on plywood portrait spanning 35.5 by 30.5 centimeters and is owned by the Braintree Museum. As you can see, it depicts an older woman with braided hair, deep in focus as she plats straw, with the completed plait winding around her forearm. The painting also came to us in the department in this lovely metallic painted frame.
So briefly, just to say what we'll be talking about today. So I'll be talking about the sitter, Hannah Freeman, a bit about her life, straw plaiting history, and also about some objects that we still have that were used by her. And then I'll go on to talk about the artist, Felicia Covington, about which much less is known, about her life, her schooling. Before Nitzan will go on to talk about the materials and techniques of this painting, talking about contemporary sources, the plywood support, about pigments and the frame. So, to start off with, I will be talking about Hannah Freeman, who is the sitter here. She was born in around 1860 and lived almost her entire life in the little village of Finchinfield in Essex. She was trained from an early age in the art of straw plaiting, which was a very popular job for village women in the home counties in the 19th century. The straw plaits were used to make hats, and at one time this work had provided these women with an independent income that rivaled and sometimes surpassed that of the farm labouring men, which, as you can imagine, led to some resentment in the men. This is the activity that we see Hannah doing in this painting, which she would have been practicing for around 60 to 70 years by the time Felicia Covington painted her portrait in the 1930s. Happily, Hannah has left us some records of her childhood through letters and interviews. These tell us that she left ordinary school at around 11 years old and attended the local plaiting school, which, to be honest, was not much of a school. It was more of a glorified factory, because these children from the ages of around 10 years old were kind of told to make plaits from 9 to 5 o'clock every single day. She would have started her mornings gleaning straw from the wheat fields around her village, which were then bleached or dyed before the round straws were passed through the spiky bone tops of these engines that you can see here, which split the straws lengthwise into thinner, more flexible strands for plaiting. You can see 2 of the engines that belong to Hannah here, which Nitzan and I got to see when we visited the Braintree District Museum's archives. And very kindly, the staff at the Braintree Museum have brought along some of the examples which are over there, so please do have a look when you go out of here towards the research forum, because they're really interesting to see. And almost all of these belongs to Hannah, so it's quite nice to have that kind of physical contact with the sitter. These straw plaits, these split straws would have then been flattened with a roller, like the one you can see at the bottom of this museum display, before being plaited into complex patterns. The enormous length of plait you can see behind the roller there, which measures about 20 yards or around 18 metres, was the minimum length of simple plait that a 10-year-old child was expected to make in a single day. The week's worth of plait would be brought to the village's plait merchant to sell, who would take them to Luton, one of the large centres of hat production. As part of Nitzan and mine, our visit to Braintree in February, we were also shown around the beautiful little village of Finchinfield, which is where both Hannah and the artist Felicia Covington lived. We worked out that the red brick building that you can see here, which is now a funeral director's, used to be the village shop where Hannah sold her plaits. Hannah would have had to know how to make many different types of plaits, as the plaiting styles changed as hat fashions developed. The plaits you see here are a selection of samples made by Hannah, which are now in the Braintree Museum's archives, and also over there right now. The plaits had some great names, including the shortcake, the whipcord, and Hannah's speciality, the brilliant, which was renowned as the most complex. When we were going through the items relating to Hannah in the archives, we also found this little note that you can see on the right here, which was attached to a straw plat, reading, Queen Mary bought this same pattern in tinted plat from Miss Freeman. So obviously, Hannah Freeman's skills as a straw platter were appreciated by even the aristocracy. Returning to the portrait, what might the plat Hannah is pictured making have actually looked like? The artist, Felicia, was clearly not all that interested in depicting the exact type of plat Hannah was making, but she did record its width and colour, and it appears to be made with bleached and red dyed straw. This vaguely resembles the plat you see on the left, although this similarity will probably be much more convincing once we remove all the paint surface dirt and yellowed varnish, which has likely drastically dulled the colours. Serendipitously, when we visited the Finchingfield Guildhall, we were shown 2 hats made by Hannah, which show this same red and white straw design. You can really see the brightness of that red in the unfaded areas under the hat ribbon, and maybe once the painting's cleaned, we'll find a similar level of brightness in the red. So, when we went to the Finchingfield Guildhall, they told us that some locals still remember Hannah, and they describe her as a very small lady of just 4 foot 6 inches tall, who almost always wore a hat. So it's as in this picture here, where she's standing at the doorway of her cottage. Interestingly, she's not wearing a hat in the portrait that we have of her, but what I really wanted to look at was why this portrait called Hannah the last of the Essex straw platters. Towards the end of the 19th century, there was a rapid and almost complete decline of the straw plaiting industry caused by competition from plats from overseas, particularly Japan, and the mechanisation of the plaiting and sewing techniques. Hannah Freeman was an outlier in this decline in that she stubbornly refused to give up her craft. She was probably in her 70s in this painted portrait, yet she was still practising straw plaiting long after everyone else had stopped. Her enlarged hands here seem to emphasise the physical toll such hard and repetitive labour would have had on her body. Hannah appears to have promoted her status as the last of the Essex straw platters to make ends meet, and she gained some minor local celebrity by demonstrating her straw plaiting at craft fairs and local WI meetings. She was interviewed a few times by people investigating dying village crafts, and she makes an appearance in one newspaper article from 1936, which included this photograph of Hannah sitting on the doorstep of her cottage in Finchingfield, plaiting busily away. I think there's some quite convincing comparisons that can be made between the painting and the photograph. In both of them, she has her hair plaited around her head. She doesn't wear a hat. She's sitting down, plaiting. The straw is wound around her arm. And this, as well as there's a couple of other factors, makes me think that it might have been made or painted at the same sort of time, so around 1936. Obviously, this is just conjecture. We can't really say. Now, moving on to the artist, Felicia Covington. Unfortunately, far less about her life is known, but we have managed to find a few interesting little details. Felicia was born in 1909 in Bristol to middle-class and wealthy parents. The earliest records we have of Felicia and her parents living in Finchingfield is 1925, when she would have been about 16 years old. They lived in one of the largest houses in the village, the Old Parsonage, which was situated just across the churchyard from Hannah's cottage. Sadly, some of the information we have found on Felicia herself comes from reports on the inquest into her death in 1937 at the age of just 28. In this, she is said to have died at her home on Cathcart Road in Chelsea, the same address written on the back of the painting. In the report, she is described as an artist of portraits and landscapes. Rather fittingly, the only other surviving painting that we've managed to find by Felicia is an undated watercolour sketch of the Dartmouth landscape, shown here. Unfortunately, it was anonymously bought at an auction, so we haven't been able to see it in person. 2 other paintings by Felicia are mentioned in various newspaper articles, and one is a landscape, one is a portrait, both made in 1935, but whether these survive, we have no idea. We don't know where they are, if they have. When researching through the old newspapers for mention of Felicia, we stumbled across one article from 1935 that placed the letters ARCA after her name. You can see that on the top left-hand corner. And this identified her as an alumna of the Royal College of Art. So we got in touch with the RCA's special collections, and they found her listed as one of their drawing and painting diploma students between 1928 and 1931. They also found this photograph of her graduating class, where you can see Felicia in the bottom left-hand corner. This is the only photograph we managed to find of her. Given that the address in the back of our painting is in Chelsea, very close to the RCA in Kensington, we can assume that the portrait was made after Felicia started studying at the college. But given its technical proficiency and the later dating of the two other references to Felicia's commercial work, we could tentatively place the date of this portrait in the early to mid 1930s, with the obvious and unfortunate cut-off date of 1937. The 1928 prospectus for the RCA tells us that Felicia's training would have involved a lot of drawing, life drawing, and the production of monthly compositions. Her teaching would have been overseen by William Rothenstein, the principal of the RCA and head of the painting and drawing school, who had been part of the Parisian avant-garde during his youth, meeting Whistler and Edmond de Goncourt, although in later years he seems to have reverted to a kind of more conservative art form. As you can see from the comparison of these two portraits, Felicia appears to have picked up on some of Rothenstein's stylistic choices, such as the broad visible brushstrokes, particularly in the background. And to discuss a bit more of this, I'm going to pass on to Nitzan.
Given how little information we had about the artist, we were hopeful that information about the RCA and their teaching at the time would give us a little bit of insight into Felicia's practice. Unfortunately, information about that was quite sparse as well, so we sought out other sources to give us an idea of the technique that she might have been exposed to. One particularly useful contemporary source is Hilaire Heiler's 1935 book, Notes on the Technique of Painting, which is a wide-ranging manual of recipes and instructions to artists about the best practice for materials and techniques. And in a lovely coincidence, the manual was accompanied by a preface written by William Rothenstein, who, as Laura has already mentioned, was principal at the RCA during Felicia's studies. In the preface, Rothenstein praises the book and stresses the importance of technical mastery and a well-built painting, which can stand the test of time. But in the quote shown on the screen, you might be able to sense a bit of despairing at his ability to get that importance across to his students, a sentiment which might be familiar to any teachers in the audience. But still, regardless of whether the lessons were taken to heart, it does seem likely that through her education at the RCA, Felicia would have become familiar with standard painting technique. That being said, the most relevant information will of course be found in the materials and techniques of the painting itself. So shown here on the left is a diagram of a proposed cross-section of the painting's construction. And essentially there are 3 layers of thin wood veneers with grain in alternating directions, which make up the plywood board. Atop that, the artist has applied a layer of glue size. She then made a charcoal sketch directly atop that, and then finally painted it directly in a single layer. As you may remember from last time, the use of plywood initially struck us as a peculiar choice, particularly if this painting was intended to be sold. That's because plywood, when subjected to humidity changes, will exhibit rather quickly periodic splitting perpendicular to the grain, called horizontal checking. And you can see 2 examples of that here on the screen. But honestly, if you looked anywhere in the painting, you would find similar issues. It's very widespread. So this is a byproduct of a step in the plywood production process and is inherent to the material. And it comes with another unfortunate side effect of paint loss at the edges of these cracks. And that's really characteristic of plywood paintings. So the issue, as I've described it to you, would not have come as a surprise to the artist. Checking does appear quickly within relatively few cycles of humidity changes. And plywood by this point had already been in use as an artist support for several decades, so it's not something that would have been completely new and unknown. So why then would a professional artist with some knowledge of materials choose plywood as a support? 2 answers readily present themselves. First, in the way that plywood was marketed.
which I've included here a Winsor & Newton catalog entry for what were called triple drawing boards, but they describe the production of plywood in the description. And they were mentioned as being less likely to warp and twist than other boards. The second reason, which we think is maybe more compelling, can be found in Hyler's manual. Though he describes plywood as apt to split and therefore risky to use, he notes that it is cheap, light, and obtainable almost anywhere. As Covington was still an artist, fresh from her degree, she therefore might have been less likely to seek out the most expensive materials, even with pieces for sale. Additionally, something we noticed early on is that the artist did not include a traditional ground layer of chalk or gypsum. Instead, what we were able to determine was that she applied a glue-sized layer atop the plywood, which would have served to reduce the absorbency of the surface. And in these images, you can see that as this kind of glossy underlayer, which fluoresces in UV light. In some areas, especially thin application, the color of the wood support is allowed to kind of shine through the paint layers, which wouldn't have been possible with the white ground, and artists of the period were sometimes noted to choose to paint on raw panels as a stylistic choice for that reason. However, this does make the paint layer more vulnerable to flaking and loss, as has been noted. To further identify the materials used by the artist and how she applied them, we also took a limited number of small samples for analysis. So for the sake of time, we won't discuss very many of them, just a few. But of course you can look at our report once it's available. This is one such, oh, I'm sorry. Gosh, I skipped something. Sorry. Above the size layer, I'll just mention, the artist planned her composition with a charcoal sketch. She mapped out Freeman's features and other compositional elements, especially with the focus of the painting, which is the hands and the straw plat. And then shadows she noted with strong blocks of hash marks. And then, as you've already seen, I've marked out a couple of those details that she highlighted as being important to include in the composition. You can get an idea of the extent of the artist's planning. Now, this is what I meant to discuss. To further identify the materials that were used by the artist and how she applied them, we did, as I said, we took a number of samples. This is one of the samples that we took from a discrete area of damage in the green background. There's a mixture of different pigments in the sample, all mixed into one paint layer. And this is kind of consistent along the samples that we took. It seems to be Covington's main method of painting directly with paint mixes rather than with glazes. The only time that she appears to use multiple layers is for discrete details like the straw, where the elements need to stand out. Using a multi-pronged approach, we incorporated different analytical techniques, ranging from simple examination under a microscope to sampling to elemental analysis with XRF and SEM-EDX. So by interpreting information from these different data streams, we were able to identify a palette of 7 pigments which the artist used throughout the painting. Yellow ochre, red lake, ultramarine blue, viridian green, umber, carbon black, and lead white. In some paint passages, only a few colors were used, such as the dark coat, which utilized brown, black, and white, while in others, a wider range of pigments were used in a single layer, mixed in varying proportions to provide subtle changes in value and hue. In addition to helping us with pigment identification, SEM-EDX alerted us to the presence of additives throughout the paint layers. In the false color map shown here on the right, pink indicates where in the sample the instrument detected the presence of calcium. We've interpreted this to be likely associated with chalk or gypsum. So this is not an unusual finding, as paint manufacturers would often add these materials to their paints as extenders, which are essentially inert fillers meant to bulk out the paint formulations so that they can stretch further at a lower cost. Essentially, this is another indication that Covington was not using top-of-the-line, most expensive materials. Now, an interesting detail that we wanted to investigate during the project was the frame that the painting entered the department in. It's metallic color with multicolored metallic stripes around the edge, a detail of which you can see on the left. We knew that the painting had been sold framed, so we did suspect from the beginning that this might be original and an artist-made frame. But still, it was kind of an unusual inclusion, perhaps tied to the design school at the RCA, which had a craft focus and which Felicia would have been exposed to during her tenure there. We hope to find evidence during our investigation to kind of more firmly attribute the frame to Covington, both to get a clear idea of the artist's intent and to help formulate an appropriate conservation treatment. To gather evidence, it was necessary to examine both the painting and the frame for clues, so we looked under the microscope and performed various non-invasive elemental analysis. Various techniques. The first detail that we noted were the stripes of silvery paint visible along the edges of the painting where it had come in contact with the frame rebate. We hoped to identify the material which made up this metallic paint and compare it against the frame, so that if they matched, it would be a good indication that the frame and portrait had been joined soon after they were painted. To determine this, we took samples from the edge of the painting with this metallic layer on top, and then also from the frame for comparison. Shown here are just two of those samples, but they give you a good idea of the results. On the left is a sample taken from the painting, which, similar to the cross-section I showed before, has that kind of green layer with a bunch of different pigments mixed in, and then this silvery reflective surface on top. And then on the right is a sample taken from the frame, which has a lead white and iron earth priming layer, and on the top, that same kind of shiny silvery layer. Using SEM-EEX, we were able to detect the presence of aluminium in both samples, shown here in the cyan false color maps. The aluminium alone was associated with this metallic material, and this kind of shows us how the artist achieved that lovely metallic effect without the expensive gilding. And what's more, the fact that both layers have the same composition made us confident that the frame and painting were likely meant to be displayed together. In conclusion, this portrait has provided us with a wealth of fascinating avenues to follow in our research. On a practical level, the use of plywood in the presence of the painted frame will pose rewarding conservation challenges, and a better understanding of the painting's materials and techniques will no doubt prove useful. Additionally, this investigation has allowed us to find out more about this unknown artist, who was just at the beginning of her career, still stylistically very much under the influence of her education, and just beginning to make a more commercial name for herself. We've also been able to learn more about the straw cladding industry and this woman who dedicated her life to the craft. And more broadly, our research has allowed us to kind of build a narrative around these two working women who lived in the same village, just a short walk away from each other, but because of their different eras and socioeconomic standing, had vastly different opportunities and experiences.
Finally, we'd just like to acknowledge all the amazing people who have helped our research, including Lizzie Jarlett and Robert Rose of the Braintree District Museum, the staff at the Finchinfield Guildhall, Neil Parkinson, who is the Archives and Collections Manager at the RCA, and of course Aviva Bernstock, Pippa Balch, and Karen Serres for the Courtauld, without whom this project would not have been possible. Thank you.
And then we'd be happy to take any questions.
I was very interested in the plywood when you said it was 3 layers, they're all glued together. I was have 2 questions. So what glue do they use to stick them together? And the second, does it seep through as much as in comparison to wood? Does it affect the whole canvas?
That's a great question. So as to the first, I was able to, through my research, just determine that it was likely an animal hide glue. I didn't conduct analysis, and in the kind of areas of split where glue might have been visible, it's kind of been washed away, which was a good indication that it was something that would be activated by water. So not something waterproof like later plywood production came into use. Phenol formaldehyde and urea formaldehyde resins, which would not be sensitive to water. And in any case, those were kind of later on came into use in like 1935, so it would have been the very tail end of our time period. So prior to that, almost exclusively was animal hide glue, so it was definitely the most likely adhesive used there. Sorry, I forgot the second.
Does water or the glue seep through the plywood? Does it affect
Mm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
It seeps into the canvas and is a
Yeah. Well, the sizing on top is definitely, it's kind of a discreet, quite thick layer. I don't know if it was maybe applied more cold even so that it didn't absorb as much, but the fact that it's plywood, it comes with its own challenges. I mean, the veneers themselves are wood, but the way that they're joined really does change their behavior so much. The sizing does a good job at keeping the paint layers from the board, but that's mainly it.
You mentioned that they used wheat straw for the plaiting. Did they use any other straws? I mean, barley straw? I know wheat straw is quite a firm straw, but did they use any others? Or
Yeah, I think they weren't too picky, honestly, from my knowledge. I mean, I don't know. Lizzie probably knows a lot more than me. Yes, from what I could tell, it was simply whichever sort of grain fields were around that village. And of course, after the grain had been harvested, then the straw lengths would have been used. But yeah, I think it was mainly wheat, but I'm sure they could have used other ones as well. Yeah.
thank you.
I was just wondering in terms of the frame, obviously since they're concluded that they're connected, are you planning to treat each frame in department? Do you have a plan for like how you're going to treat them in conjunction, or whether you'll be talking to a frame conservator, or sort of what your plan is?
That's a really great question. There's been a lot of thinking around this. It is, because it's painted and not gilded, it is more in my arena than normal frame would be. I think also, during some visits to some museums and conservation studios, we've had the opportunity to kind of talk with frame conservators about experience that they might have had with painted frames. I think being in consultation would be great. I'm kind of conscious of the fact that it is time limited now, that there's 1 year left. Much of the first term will be dedicated to my third year project. So it's going to be definitely an exercise in time management, even without taking into account the frame. But I think just aesthetically it would be a great benefit to it, even just a surface clean, because it kind of, that the surface dirt is disguising a little bit that kind of reflective quality of it. But I think it's something that would need to be discussed with the owner and kind of see if logistically it's feasible. Any other questions?
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. Going back to straw, I'm interested in Hannah's craft, and obviously it was a well-known craft going on in painting fields not far from where I live. And I just wondered whether it was used just for hats or any other sort of accessories, belts, handbags, things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We didn't include it in this presentation because of time, but the Finchingfield Guildhall do have a bag that was kind of made from planted straws by Hannah. So yeah, it's quite a big bag as well, it's about that kind of size. So yeah, they were definitely using it for other things. I think by the sort of 1910s, 1920s, mostly the hats were being made for men. Women weren't using straw hats quite as much. So yeah, no, it was definitely diversified.
Thank you for your presentation. My question was, we might have mentioned this already, do you know who commissioned the painting?
Very good question. No, we don't. We have absolutely no idea how it came in. I mean, I don't know if it would have been commissioned or if it was just Felicia deciding to paint a local person of interest and then deciding to try and sell it. Like there are some on the back. I mean, you can discuss it more, but. there are like potential of like 6
yes.
prices.
Yeah, written on the back there's by the artist. It says that it was 6 GNS, which is believed to be guineas. So we do believe it was sold. As for whether it was commissioned, I think that's unlikely. She was still very early on in her career, and I think it makes sense that she would have taken the opportunity with a kind of local celebrity like Hannah, who genuinely, such a 3-minute walk away.
Yeah.
Someone that would have encountered to take the opportunity to paint her, and it would have benefited them both and kind of put forward that narrative of the last straw platter. I think that's a lot more likely than a planned commission. If that's all, we will turn it over to Ursula and Ben for their presentation about the portrait of Nauroji.
Hi everyone. Thank you for sticking around to the very end of, I guess today, but also the year's Painting Pairs presentations. We're very excited, but also sad to end the program off. My name is Benjamin Singer, and I am the MA History of Art student on this project.
And I'm Ursula Griffiths, and I'm the conservation student on this project. So we're returning here to the results session of our project looking at this painting, Portrait of Dadabhai Nauroji by Saurabh Pithwala, painted in 1946, which previously hung in the India Club on the Strand. Before we begin, those who attended the previous session may notice a difference in the appearance of this painting. And this is because alongside this research project, I've also been undertaking the conservation treatment of the painting. And as you can see now, I've cleaned the thick layer of discolouring surface dirt from this painting, revealing the true colour palette of the painting, alongside giving a clearer view of the artist's technique, with fine brushwork and subtle modulation and tone. This treatment of the painting is still in progress, and the image I'm showing you here on the right shows the painting after cleaning and applying an initial varnish. So, returning to the research of this painting. In the last session of talks, we established our overarching research aim that we've explored over the past few months, to position this painting at the colonial and immediate post-colonial period of Indian art and investigate its visual and material elements. As our research has taken shape, we've each found specific foci that have really interested us in terms of answering this question, and we hope to share with you some of this today. Firstly, Ben will be discussing this specific depiction of Dadabhai Nauroji and the way he chose to present himself as his political career developed in England. Secondly, I will turn to situating this painting within the history of oil painting in India as an aesthetic and artistic imposition of British colonial rule.
As can be easily seen from just a simple glance at Ursula and I's canvas, our research concerns a portrait. And as could be guessed from that, one of the primary focuses of our research so far has been uncovering who the sitter is, Dadabhai Nauroji, and following this, discerning why he wanted to present himself in this way and why the artist, as well, Saurabh Pithwala, wanted to present him in this fashion. Prior to getting into some of our findings, however, I think it's important to briefly go over some of what we discussed in our last presentation, namely, who was Dadabhai Nauroji. Nauroji was born in Bombay in India, which is now referred to as Mumbai, to a Parsi Zoroastrian family in 1825. This identity would come to guide and define his intellectual life and work for decades to come. Born at a time when the British East India Company still retained control over the subcontinent, Nauroji's life would exist at and shape the intersection of British and Indian political life. Though I separate them here to demonstrate the distinct roles held by Nauroji, it's important to remember that the timelines of all of these events are overlaid and intertwined. The first way in which we can all think of Nauroji is as the academic. His career in this regard began in 1854 when he was appointed a professor at Elphinstone College, making him the first Indian national to hold such a position at any British-run college in India. Subsequently, from 1856 until 65, Nauroji took up a professorship at University College in London. His academic career is perhaps best remembered by his economics, and specifically the influential drain of wealth theory, which he developed to elucidate the growing impoverishment of the Indian people under British colonial rule as a result of the unilateral transfer of wealth from the Indian colony to the British metropole. The second way that we can think of Nauroji throughout his life is as the activist. During his time in Bombay, when he first began teaching, Nauroji played an important role in the establishment of the Bombay Association, which would eventually help pave the way for the birth of the Indian National Congress, or INC, an immensely influential force in Indian anti-colonial politics. Upon moving to England, Nauroji helped to found the East India Association in London in 1867, an organization which functioned to convey the Indian perspective to the British public. And it was in 1885 when Nauroji would help found the aforementioned INC, over which he presided as president through multiple terms between 1886 and 1906. The final way that we can think of Nauroji, as it pertains to our presentation, is as the politician. In 1892, Nauroji was elected as a Liberal MP for Central Finsbury, right here in London, making him the first Indian member of British Parliament. It was from this position that he continued his career advocating for the Indian perspective amidst British society. Given the many roles in which Nauroji took on, one of our central questions of research then became, in which role is Nauroji depicted here in Pitwala's portrait? In order to answer this question, Ursula and I followed a number of different lines of inquiry, all of which concerned Nauroji's self-fashioning throughout his own life. Our first line of inquiry in this regard took the form of compiling and analyzing as many depictions of Nauroji from different stages throughout his career that we could get our hands on, as a means to track the changes in the ways that he wanted himself presented and in the ways that artists presented him. Two photographs of Nauroji can now be seen on screen. On the left, one from 1889, and on the right one from 1892. While similarities definitely exist between the two, Nauroji's beard and glasses for instance, very significant differences can be seen that shed light on the different methods of self-fashioning being undertook by Nauroji at this time. Of particular importance here and to our project is, firstly, the headdress worn by Nauroji on the left and not worn by Nauroji on the right, as well as the difference in clothing Nauroji chooses to wear. He moved from wearing a more traditional, long-shirted Parsi outfit to a more in line with British fashions of the time, shirt with over-jacket laid over top. The headdress, specifically known as a padri, is a traditional hat worn by Parsi men, and despite wearing it for much of his life, as is documented in this photo from 1889, Nauroji decided to stop wearing it as often, and especially doing so in political settings, once he took up political office in London. Interestingly, though these two photos are taken only 3 years apart, they represent a distinct transition in Nauroji's identity. Namely, the year that the second photo was taken, 1892, was the year Nauroji was elected to British Parliament. As Dinyar Patel, a scholar who focuses on Nauroji's career as a pioneer of Indian nationalism, writes of Nauroji's dress during this time period, quote, "Uncomfortable with the wholesale adoption of Western attire, Nauroji crafted a hybrid outfit. He wore a broadcloth coat and black trousers, tying around his neck a silk handkerchief that was held in place by a gold ring. He continued wearing the traditional Parsi pagri on the streets of the city and Westminster. Once he decided to stand for Parliament, however, Nauroji knew he could no longer dress as a half-Indian, half-Briton. William Digby, as he noted in his diary, once strongly recommended to Nauroji to change the headdress to a more English-fitting hat. On the hustings, the Parsi candidate was often hatless, dressed in a somber, double-breasted suit and tie, much like the one that we can see in this photograph and our portrait of Nauroji. Thus, it seems Nauroji's self-fashioning in this time period brought him closer in line with the aesthetic of those Britons, his colleagues in Parliament, whose minds he was trying to work to change, while also maintaining key aesthetic similarities to the people for whom he was trying to advocate for. For instance, rather than beginning to adorn a white collared shirt underneath his breasted blazer, Nauroji chooses to wear a still dark short underneath, something that potentially forms an allusion to the traditional, more Parsi outfit that he used to wear. Also of interest was that Nauroji during this temporal period was not the only Parsi MP elected to political office in Britain. Mancherji Banagri was elected MP for Bethnal Green in the election just after Nauroji's, in 1895. Walking a similar path to Nauroji, Bonagri undertook a similar visual transformation to Nauroji, attempting to mix loyalty with his heritage, but also an aesthetic fitting in with his newfound colleagues in Parliament. Additionally, though from slightly later, another Indian MP, Shapoorji Saklatvala, was selected in 1924. These men would have likely looked to Nauroji's example, and therefore, a visual comparison of depictions between these men can heighten our understanding of the ways and reasons regarding Nauroji's self-fashioning. Interestingly, as I mentioned before, Nauroji is the only one of these men not to eventually adorn himself in that traditional white button-up shirt, more fitting of British fashion at the time, marking him as the furthest away then from the typical visual aesthetic of the late 19th century and early 20th century British Member of Parliament. As we have mentioned, this depiction of Nauroji that we are dealing with for our project was not painted during his lifetime, but rather 3 decades after his death in 1917. It was painted in 1946. Given this, it's likely that Pitwala would have turned to previous depictions of Nauroji and or photographs of him, such as the ones we've shown, to guide his painting of this portrait. Then the question becomes, why turn to depictions of Nauroji where he's presenting himself in his politician self-fashioning as opposed to any other time in his life? The answer to this seems to lie in the socio-political circumstances of Bombay in 1946 and 1947. As we can see from 2 newspaper clippings here from the Hindustan Times, in 1946, a sailors' revolt occurred in Bombay against British forces. This event was one of the catalysts in a series of events that would eventually form the basis for the independence of India, granted in 1947, less than a year after Pitwala painted this portrait of a figure who worked his entire life to gain this moment. It seems then that in a time of much political interaction between the British and India, and in a moment when Nauroji's goals perhaps seem closer than ever to finally being achieved, Pitwala chose to reflect on Nauroji in a state when he embodied this immense complexity between India and Britain relations, while also working to end that intertwinement, a perfect vehicle to express the whims of the moment. While time does not exist in this presentation to go into detail about the other avenues of our historical research that will be included in our final report, which we both encourage you to read, of course, I did want to touch on this section, which we will discuss, as it relates to the object biography of this portrait. As mentioned, prior to our conservation work and the closing of the club, Pitwala's portrait of Nauroji hung in the India Club. Established in 1951 by members of the India League and under the leadership of Krishna Menon, the club served as a place for Indian nationals and allies to gather, enjoy, and converse in the heart of London. On the walls, Nauroji was joined by portraits and depictions of other influential Indian leaders, inspiration perhaps for the conversations taking place at the tables below. The club sat squarely in the center of British-Indian relations, being home away from home for those working to share the Indian message in London. As such, it formed the perfect establishment for the portrait of Nauroji, which, as we have discussed today, depicts a man who sat at that exact same intersection.
So as part of this study, I undertook a full technical investigation of the materials and techniques of this painting, which I will come to later. However, these findings are not useful in discussion without first looking at the context for the production of this painting. Therefore, I'd like to share with you a short version of the very complex history of oil painting in the Western academic style in India, contextualizing the work of Saurabh Pitwala, the artist, in terms of Indian art education under the British Raj, which will hopefully demonstrate to you why the medium of this painting, oil, is so notable. So education was a significant method of control of the British Raj and included efforts in the 1850s to introduce academic art education as a method to control both artistic production and taste. An exemplar of one of these schools is the Sir Jamesti Jejeebhoy School of Art in Bombay, and the school was set up as a result of endowment of 100,000 rupees from Sir Jamesti Jejeebhoy, a Parsi philanthropist, in 1857. His desire to form a school followed his involvement in the selection committee for the 1851 exhibition of London, where he was not only exposed to the greatest craftsmen of India, but also became aware of their need, since British rule had crippled the buying power of the Indian people, and as a result the livelihoods of native artisans, which made up around 25% of the population of Western India at this time. His conception for the school was as a centre for the improvement of native craftsmen from the middle and lower classes, as a method to increase employment opportunities. His endowment ensuring that the fees for the school would be free for students. Notably, the curriculum for the school was based on one designed by the Committee of Council on Education from the Department of Science and Art from South Kensington, focused on a scientific approach to drawing and delivered by teachers from England. And as you can see from this quote from the first report from the School of Art, their aim of the improvement and augmentation of industrial arts practiced in this country, rather than the creation of a school for the imaginative painters and sculptors, is very notable. Soon after its establishment, however, the nature of teaching at the school began to change and reflected an aim far removed from that originally conceived by Sir Jamesy Jejeebhoy. In 1864, the Department of Public Instruction took control of the school, alongside other art schools across India, and soon the school became a vehicle for the dissemination of Western taste and technique. The basis of the curriculum in drawing remained. However, a new influx of teachers from the Department of Science and Art at South Kensington was brought to the school, including Mr. John Griffiths, a painter. As a result, the school gained a greater focus on the fine arts and moved away from an institute of technical education. The students were now preparing for careers as artists rather than as craftsmen. Fees of the school also began to increase, and by 1880 they were 1,577 rupees annually, attracting pupils from the upper classes rather than craftsmen as originally intended. Under John Griffiths, the drawing classes were split into 3 grades and English textbooks were used as teaching aids. It was only once students had passed examinations in 3 drawing grades they were able to specialise in sculpture, architectural drawing or painting, where they would be instructed to paint in watercolour and in oil. Teaching of oil painting was particularly notable as a new medium for Indian painters. Students in painting at the Sir J.J. School of Art were therefore producing paintings in the Western academic style in the Western medium of oil painting, resulting in a significant alteration to the visual culture of Western India. British government in India and colonial art education thus completely altered the techniques used by Indian artists, and by extension, the function of art in Indian society. Colonial art education also resulted in the breakdown of the artist-patron relationship previously established in Indian art, and artists relied instead on state-sponsored exhibitions to gain recognition and sell their work, imitating the art salons of Europe. Essentially, the teaching of European techniques in state-sponsored art schools and the accompanying changes in art display and buying made India a cultural satellite of Europe. It was under the teaching of John Griffiths at the Sir J.J. School of Art that several distinguished portrait painters working in the Western academic style rose to great fame, and one of these artists was Manchesor Pithwalla, the father of the artist of art painting. Manchesor Pithwalla studied at the Sir J.J. School of Art from 1888 to 1996. He'd gained significant recognition in the salon-style exhibitions held by the Bombay Art Society, winning a silver medal in 1894 while still a pupil of the school, and later going on to win a gold medal in 1907. After his education was complete, he went on to become a highly sought-after portrait artist amongst British officials and governors and the Parsi community. Notably, he was commissioned in 1905 to execute 14 watercolours depicting the different castes of Indian women to be presented from the women of Bombay to the Princess of Wales for her visit to India with Queen Mary in 1905. And you can see on the right of the screen the depiction of a Parsi lady. The understanding of Manchesor Pithwalla's training at the Sir J.J. School of Art and his career is critical when considering that of Saurabh Pithwalla, who is far less documented than his father. He did not pursue a formal art education in painting, but instead trained under his father for 10 years, learning the Western academic style. Like his father, he was successful in gaining prizes at art exhibitions of the Bombay Art Society and gained extensive patronage from the Parsi elite of Bombay. We can therefore understand Saurabh Pithwalla as a second-generation artist of the Western academic school of the Western academic style of painting in Bombay, and his oil painting technique is a distillation of the teachings under John Griffiths at the Sir J.J. School of Art. This is the lens through which the technical study of this painting is most interesting. Overall, the materials of this painting reflect what is to be expected of a Western academic portrait. We have a canvas prepared in a very traditional Western methodology for this period, first using a chalk and animal glue, followed by a lead white oil-containing priming layer. We then have a very limited palette to execute the work using iron-containing earth pigments in the background, bone black for the black jacket, and a mixture of lead white, vermilion, earth colours, and a synthetic red lake pigment to model the face. What was interesting about the elemental investigation of these pigments was that whilst undertaking elemental mapping of small cross-sections taken across the painting, each paint layer, including the dark passages of paint, contains zinc. The fact that each layer contains this element provides evidence that the compound zinc stearate is an additive in this paint. This finding is indicative of commercially available true paints of the period, such as those produced by Winsor and Newton, where zinc stearate was used as a dispersing agent. The most notable findings in technical investigation of this work link to the range of painting techniques used by Saurabh Pithiwala, which connect to those used by artists trained at the Sir J.J. School of Art. For example, the brown backgrounds that we see across portraits produced by Indian artists of the Western Academic School were investigated as part of this study. A paint cross-section taken from the brown background of this painting shows a more complex layer structure than we might expect. What we have is subsequent layers of an opaque warm brown paint coupled with an intermediary glaze of dark brown transparent paint. And you can see that hopefully on the screen with the sort of bright brown and then this sort of layer that appears almost black and then that layer on top again. And such a technique employing thin discrete layers of paint reflects the academic style in India, whereby rich tones and subtle shifts in hue were achieved with layering whilst keeping to a highly limited palette. In contrast to this layering system, a cross-section taken from the face of the sitter reveals a different technique used to execute the faces. You can see from this cross-section that wet and wet blending of oil paints has been used to model Nairoji's facial features. Here you can see a pale buff-coloured initial layer that's been blended into a slightly warmer brown layer above, and you can see that it's blended whilst the oil paint is still wet, because you don't have those clear lines between the paint layers like you did in the previous cross-section. And these two layers are then topped by a thinner, darker brown glaze, which have been used to model the shadows of the sitter's face once the paint had dried. Overall, technical examination of the materials of this painting have been enlightening of the highly sophisticated range of techniques used by Saurabh Pithiwala as a second generation of the Western Academic School in India. These techniques speak to exceptional skill in the use of oil paint as a medium, reflecting these initial teachings of John Griffiths from the Sir Jamsi Jejeebhoy School of Art, Bombay.
Well, the information that Ursula and I have provided you with today has existed in a number of distinct categories. We hope to leave you with one central through line, that in every facet of this painting, the complex history of Indo-British relations is manifest. Through the sitter, Nairoji, whose life was dedicated to understanding and ending British rule in India, to Pithiwala's choosing to portray Nairoji in the political phase of his life, and in a moment when Indo-British relations were reaching a head in Bombay, right down to the way in which Pithiwala learned to paint, from his father, who was educated in a westernized system under British colonial rule. Pithiwala's portrait of Dada Nairoji, both visually and material then, exists at that same intersection of Indo-British relation as does the sitter who it tries to depict.
So here's just a little select bibliography, but importantly, I'd just like to thank Yagar Marker, obviously, as the owner of this painting, for the amazing range of information he's been able to give us about the history of this painting. I'd also like to notably thank Mr. Anupam Sar and Mr. Prakash Sonaway, who were immensely helpful for interpreting the results of my technical investigation, and they've been absolutely fantastic with that. And lastly, I'd like to thank Aviva Bernstock for her organisation of the Painting Pairs programme. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, it's a really interesting presentation, such a beautiful portrait. I was just wondering when you looked at the materials and techniques, because I can see that in the black jacket the paint texture is very kind of distinctive. Did you get any explanation for what's caused that?
Yes, that was something that I had really set out to try and work out in my initial investigation, and I have a slide of it a little bit up close for people to see. Here we go. So essentially what has happened is it's called reticulated drying cracking, where the upper layer of paint has, as it's dried, pulled away from the lower paint, causing these sort of islands, and that's what you can see on the black jacket. And as part of my material investigation, I tried to work out if there was a sort of resin component in the lower layer of paint which was causing this, as is quite common in British examples of this period. And what I found was the results of the FTIR that we ran were fairly inconclusive, and it didn't speak to anything particular in terms of resins being added. And what it seems to speak to instead is the way it was painted. And what I was talking about with the experts in Mumbai was that often these black jackets were painted in a single sitting. So what you have is that thick initial layer of paint, and then you have a much more glossy high and medium containing one to just map out the details like the buttons and the lapels. And I think what that is in terms of the cracking is just something that's been added far too soon, and that's why you have it rather than any additives in the paint. So it's more artist technique rather than material, and apparently it's very common amongst paintings of Manchester and Saurabh in terms of this phenomenon.
Lovely presentation again, thank you. I'm very interested with how you lightened the beard so dramatically from the original. I mean, how many years did you say the discoloration took place? Oh, what was when it was painted? Just remind me what the period of time was when it was painted to date, really. When you've resurrected this painting, as it were.
No, that's an excellent question. I will just bring up the side-by-side of what we have before and after. So the painting was given to the India Club in 1946, and it hung there until a couple of years ago. And what has happened is not discoloration of the paint, but it's the accumulation of a thick layer of surface dirt on it. So the painting was displayed without glass in front of it, so accumulated this surface dirt directly on the paint surface, and the paint itself was unvarnished. So what you have is accumulation of kind of what you'd expect of hanging in a restaurant for such a long period of time. Also, it was hanging on the Strand, that's where the India Club was, and what you'd have is the pollution from the street also coming in, and also people would smoke in restaurants still quite recently. So what you have is accumulation of, grease, particulate dirt from pollution, and also nicotine. So that is what's causing the kind of discoloration, is this layer of surface dirt, which then I was able to clean off to reveal what's below.
How long did it take? Had obviously quite a few layers, I'd say, but how long did it take you to get to that?
That's such an excellent question, because it took the cleaning process itself didn't take hugely long, a couple of months perhaps, but the actual testing to find what was suitable to clean the painting took far longer, because what you have is dirt directly on the surface of an unvarnished painting, so you don't have an intermediary layer to sort of protect the paint while you're cleaning. And finding something that wouldn't affect the paint whilst removing the surface dirt was sort of the limiting factor in time for cleaning.
Can I ask what you used?
Oh, you can so ask what I used. So it was an unusual technique by the end. We exhausted a lot of options for it, and because the layer of surface dirt was so thick, we ended up breaking up that initial layer with something called N-methylpyrrolidone, which is it's a high oil sweller to sort of target that grease. And that was in very, very short exposures because you don't want to target the oil painting below. So that kind of broke up that top layer, and then we used a chelator, which was sodium tripolyphosphate, which is particularly good at chelating away metal ions, which are often found in surface dirt, and it was also helpful in removing the greasy surface dirt because it's high pH, so it sort of helps to saponify that dirt component. So that's what was used.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Two questions. What are you going to do with this coat? Is it going to be sort of come back to its former glory, or is this what it's going to be?
In terms of the appearance
of the coat? Yeah.
No, it's definitely not. And so the coat is still a little undersaturated, as you can see, and it's not quite the way that the paint surface has done those drying cracks that I was talking about before. It's kind of still scatters the light. So the picture I'm showing you now is only after the first varnish. And after that, I'm going to be retouching those little losses, which you can see as sort of white bits are across the coat and in the background, and there's one in the face. So I'll be retouching those, and then I'm going to be doing a process of building up varnish to make sure that that coat is sort of a bright, black, saturated one again, where you can see all those details.
So after it's been done, are you going to put it under glass? Because obviously it wasn't before.
I would most definitely recommend it. It will be up to the choice of where it's going back to afterwards, and also notably because I varnished it, it has that added layer of protection. So even if it was chosen to not have glass in front of it, it would be easier to clean again because you have that layer that protects the paint. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
So just thanking all the speakers who really have put on amazing presentations. I'm very proud of them, and it's been a fantastic afternoon. So thank everyone, and so thank you.